Good morning, this is your Stat Sensei, Mr. Sensei, and this is an assignment on reading computer printouts. So first off, the very first thing I want to do is I want to identify my y-intercept row. So that's my y-intercept row. And remember, when we're working with regression, we're always working with y equals mx plus b, but for this class, we're going to do y hat equals b plus mx, where b is our y-intercept. All right, where b is our y-intercept, and our slope is plain old m. So this would be my slope row, and this is my y-intercept row. It's really easy to identify the y-intercept row because it has the word constant. So look for the word constant, and you have your y-intercept row, and right below that will be your slope row. So the very first thing it asks for is our explanatory variable, where our explanatory variable is just our x. Well, in this case, our explanatory variable is lead. So we're going to go ahead and label this A right there. Okay? And that's on the slope row, and it always will be. The explanatory variable will always be on a slope row. The next thing is our y-intercept. Well, our y-intercept is going to be on the y-intercept row, and it's going to be the very first number. So this one will be 16.3, and this is B. Then it asks for our slope. Well, guess what? It's on the slope row. So if it's on the slope row, the very first number that shows up is 19.0, and that is our slope. Then it asks for a regression equation, which is going to be y hat equals, we want it in b plus mx format. So that's going to be 16.3 plus m for our slope, which happens to be, in this case, 19.0 times our x value. All right? Once again, this is our y-intercept, and this was my slope. And we're just following the y hat equals b plus mx. Next thing it asks for is standard error of the slope. So we have two key words, but the first thing I want to point out is it says slope. So I'm looking for the slope row. Well, the slope row, and sometimes it won't say standard error. Sometimes it'll say SE for standard error. Sometimes it'll say standard deviation. But we're looking on the slope row, and our value is going to be 1.89. So this is letter E. The next thing it is asked for is the t-statistic for the slope. Well, we have two t-statistics, but it says specifically for the slope. So we must be looking on the slope row, which is 10.01. Then it asks for the p-value, but it asks for the p-value, and we have two p-values, but we're looking for the p-value of the slope, and the p-value of the slope means I'm looking on the slope row, and I should go back and label this as an F. And on the slope row, that means in our case, it's 0.00, and that's letter G on the slope row. The last thing it asks for is the coefficient of determination. Well, that's our R squared, and we leave it as a percent. Sometimes it'll have an R squared adjusted, which we will never use, but here's our R squared at 82%. And we'll leave it as a percent, and that'll be our coefficient of determination, or 82%. All right, continuing on. So moving on to number 2. So on number 2, once again, we ask for our explanatory variable. Well, the very first thing we want to do is identify our y-intercept row. Well, our y-intercept row always starts with the word constant every single time. And remember, we're basically working with y equals mx plus b, but for our class, we're going to be doing, for statistics, we're going to do y equals b plus mx, where b is our y-intercept and m will be our slope. So Slope row is in pink. So here's my slope row, and this is my y-intercept. So we're looking for our explanatory variable, and the explanatory variable is just our x, and it's always right below the constant. It's on the slope row, and it's right below the constant. So in this case, it's average temp. So that's going to be our letter A right there. The next thing it asks for is our y-intercept. Well, if it says y-intercept, that's going to be on our y-intercept row. So I need to be looking for the value on the y-intercept row that's our constant. Okay, well, that first value happens to be our y-intercept, and that's 389.8.20, and that's letter B. The next one's pretty easy. It's slope. Well, guess what? It's on the slope row, and it's right next to our x variable, and our slope in this case is negative 50.9027. The next thing it asks for is the regression equation. Well, that just means write it in y hat equals b plus mx format. So in this case, y hat equals 3898.2 minus 50.9. I'm running out of room, so I'm going to shorten that up. Okay, and this right here is my slope, and this is my y-intercept. All right. The next thing it asks for is standard error of the slope. So I'm going to be looking on the slope row, but I'm going to look for standard error, which is right there. I notice I have two standard errors, but this happens to be standard error of the slope, and standard error of the slope will be 4.980. Next, it asks for the t-statistic, but it's asking for the slope, so I need to be looking at the slope row, and that's going to be negative 10.22, and that's going to be letter F. Then we're going to look for the p-value of the slope. Well, I have two p-values, but I need to be on the slope row, and the slope row says, hey, it's 0. Okay, as I've said before, the coefficient of determination is our r squared. All right? Well, in this case, we have two r squareds. In this class, we will never use r squared adjusted. So our coefficient of determination, our r squared, is 91.3%, and we'll keep it as a percent. So 91.3%. All right, number 3, explanatory variable. Well, first off, the very first thing I want to do is I want to identify my y-intercept row and my slope row. Well, constant tells me what my y-intercept row every single time. So there's my y-intercept. And remember, we want it to look like y equals mx plus b. But for our class, we're going to write it in y hat equals b plus mx, where b is our y-intercept and m is our slope. So there's our y-intercept row, and the row right below it every single time happens to be our slope row. So for number 3, it asks for the explanatory variable. Well, the explanatory variable, as we've said before, is just our x. And our x is always directly, well, first off, it's going to be on the, because it's an x, it's going to be on the slope row, and it's the first word under constant, which happens to be years. And every single time, we will always find it directly under constant. Then it asks for our y-intercept. Well, that means, hey, I need to be on the y-intercept row. Well, the y-intercept row, I'm looking for, in this case, I'm looking for my b, and my B in this case is 2939.93. 2,939.93. This is B and this is A. The next thing it asks for is my slope. Well, guess what? Slope is going to be on the slope row. And in this case, it's right here, right below my y-intercept, and it's 233.517. So that's letter C. Then it asks for the regression equation. Remember we said we want it to look like y hat equals b plus mx. So y hat equals 2939.9. I'm going to abbreviate because I don't have a whole lot of room. Plus 233.5 x. All right. The next thing it asks for is it asks for the standard error of the slope. Well, the fact that it mentions the word slope tells me it's going to be on the slope row. All right. Well, standard error, there's standard error, and I have two of them. There's for my y-intercept, but this is we want it for my slope. So it's going to be 4.316. And that's letter E. Then it asks for t-statistic for the slope. Well, once again, I have two t-statistics, but we specifically want it for the slope, which means I'm looking at 54.11 on the slope row. Then it asks for the p-value. Well, we have two p-values. Now, they happen to be the same, but we want it for the slope, so it's going to be the 0.000 on the slope row. The next thing it asks for is the coefficient of determination, and I don't see that word. You have to know that the coefficient of determination is our r squared. All right? So we're going to be looking for r squared because r squared is going to be our coefficient of determination. And I notice I have two r squareds. But in this class, we will never use r squared adjusted ever. We're just going to use plain old r squared, and we always leave it as a percent. So 79.3%. Moving right along to number 4. All right, once again, let's identify our y-intercept row. So that's my y-intercept row. And if you notice, we have a bunch of different looking computer printouts, but they're all set up basically the same way. You need to identify the word constant. And once you identify the word constant, you have your y-intercept row, and then the row below it is the slope row. And as I keep saying, for this class, well, in algebra, you wrote y equals mx plus b. But for this class, we're going to do y hat equals b plus mx, where b is our y-intercept and m is our slope. Okay? So let's start filling this out. On number 4, it says ask for the explanatory variable. Well, explanatory variable is going to be on the slope row every single time, and it's the word directly below constants, and it'll always be there. So this is just asking for our x, which in this case happened to be years. The next thing it asks for is our y-intercept. Bing, 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 it's going to be on our y-intercept row. And the y-intercept is a value where it crosses the y-axis, and that happens to be 11. The next thing is that asks for is our slope. And our slope, guess what? It's on the slope row. In this case, it's 13.9826. The next thing we asked for is our regression equation. We're always going to start off with y hat equals b plus mx. So y hat equals, there's our b, 11 plus 13.9826, and we just put an x there. All right. So that takes care of um, writing our regression equation. Excuse me, I'm going to put that C there. Then it asks for standard error of the slope. Well, if I notice, I see the word slope, slope, slope. That means I need to be on the slope row. Well, standard error of the slope, sometimes they say standard deviation, but standard error of the slope and standard deviation of the slope are going to be the same thing. So in this case, we have 1.506, and that is letter F. The next thing it asks for is the t-statistic of the slope. Well, if you notice, we have two t-statistics, but we want the one on the slope row. So that's going to be 9.25. And then it also asks for the p-value of the slope. Well, we have two p-values, but we need the one on the slope row. And the one on the slope row is 0.001. And once again, we ask for coefficient of determination, but we don't see that up there. But we do see the term r squared, and r squared happens to be our coefficient of determination. So but unfortunately, I have two r squareds. The good thing is for this course, we will never use r squared adjusted. We are only going to use the 93.4% as our r squared, and we'll write it as a percent, and it's 93.4%, and that's r squared. All right, scenario 5. On scenario 5, once again, we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to find my y-intercept row. We're going to look for the word constant. There it is. So there's my y-intercept row. All right. We're going to go ahead and label that y-intercept. And the row below it is always, and is in this case, the slope row. So we have y equals mx plus b, but for this class, it's going to be y hat equals b plus mx. So we're always going to use that format. All right, the explanatory variable. The explanatory variable is my x, and x is associated with slope, and it's always the word directly below constant. So in this case, my x value, my explanatory variable happens to be the word price. So price is my explanatory variable. Excuse me. Should have had that slide down just a little bit. Then the next thing it asks for is my y-intercept. Well, my y-intercept is going to be on the y-intercept row. I mean, that shouldn't be a surprise. Y-intercept on the y-intercept row, and it happens to be my first coefficient. So 410.997. The next thing it asks for is my slope. Oh, there is a key word, slope. So that probably tells me it's going to be on the slope row, and sure enough, it is. And so my slope happens to be 5.52979. It asks for the regression equation. Now remember, we're going to do y equals b, which is my y-intercept, and then m, which is my slope. So y hat, that's what we're starting with, equals 410.997 plus, I'm going to have to abbreviate this, so I'm going to have to shorten it up, 5.53x, where this right here is my y-intercept, and this is my slope. All right. Moving along, we get to standard error of the slope. Matter of fact, on these next ones, I see the word slope, slope, slope. Guess what? That means they're all going to be on the slope row. And on the slope row, I go, okay, standard error of the slope. There's standard error, and this is my slope row. So this is 1.135, letter E. Then it asks for the t statistics. So I got two t statistics, but it wants it of the slope, so it needs to be on the slope row. So this is 4.87. And then it asks for the p-value of the slope. Well, that means I got two p-values, but I really want the one on the slope row. So this is going to be 0.000, and this is letter G. And the last thing it asks for is the coefficient of determination, and I don't see that anywhere. All right, but you have to remember coefficient of determination is our r squared. So coefficient of determination is r squared. So I need to find r squared. Well, I happen to see two r squareds. But in this case, in this class, we will never use r squared adjusted, ever. All right, we'll only use r squared. So in this case, we're looking at 68.3%. All right, I hope this helps. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.